Okay, welcome everyone. Parshat Balak. As all portions, so much to learn. So just in case people don't know, the basic story is that Israel is getting ready to enter into the land of Israel. And Balak, the king of Moab, is totally scared. And he hires Bilam, a famous, we'll call him here a magician, a expert in witchcraft, to curse the Jews. It was known that Bilam's curses were effective, and Balak is willing to pay a lot of money in order for him to curse the Jews, in the belief that they will then not be a problem for his kingdom. So the Talmud discusses, well, how did Bilam curse people? Like, what was the secret behind his art of witchcraft? How did he have effective curses? And so the Talmud says that Bilam knew the moment of God's anger, and he would connect at that split moment to God's anger, and he would able to curse the Jews, or curse anyone. So let's try to understand what this means, though. What does that mean that he could discern the moment of God's anger? So there is a verse in the 7th Psalm that says, Kel zoem b'chol yom. God, again, as it were, gets angry every day. But there's another verse that says just the opposite. Chesed kel kol hayom. The mercies, the giving, the loving kindness of God is constant the entire day. Now, the verse about anger doesn't say that God is angry all the day. It just says every day there is some anger from God. So we want to understand this, because this is obviously an anthropomorphic phrase, that God gets angry. So how do we understand that? So we have these two verses. One says that God's loving kindness is constant every day, and the other one says that God gets angry. So these are the two represented by the two sfirot, Chesed and Gevura. And they appear to be opposites, Chesed and Gevura. But we say it in the Shema every day. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hashem Elokeinu is Hashem Elokim. The name Hashem Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is associated with loving kindness. And the name Elokim is associated with Gevura, which could mean judgment, severity. But we know that both of these energies are needed in the universe. The laws of nature are associated with the name Elokim. And without the laws of nature, we have no world. The laws of nature is, in a sense, the greatest chesed that God could give for us. That we have a world where, I mean, if you contemplate that right now, the earth is spinning on its axis at hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour. The earth going around the sun is traveling at tens of thousands of miles an hour. The entire Milky Way is rotating at phenomenal speeds, and yet we're all sitting here calmly as if nothing is happening. That's the laws of nature. The laws of nature allow life to exist. So we have these two verses. So when we talk about God's anger, we're using a human term. And really what we mean is that this force that we call gevura, might, strength, judgment, and sometimes severity, is balanced perfectly by God's loving kindness. But there is this idea that since these energies exist all the time, and we're saying that really gevura is also a type of chesed. But we know that there's judgment in the world. There's some heavy things going on. There is judgment in the world. So Bilam was able to tune in to that moment where he felt there was a vacuum of God's loving kindness, and in that moment he could curse the Jews. So the Gemara asks, well, how long is this moment? And depending on how you calculate, there are different opinions, but we're talking about a fraction of a second. All of the opinions we're talking about a fraction of a second. So there is a verse, if anyone wants to look it up, it's the 23rd chapter of the book of Numbers. And we are talking about verse 7 and 8. So it says like this. I won't read it in Hebrew. I'll just read it in English. So Bilam, this is right when he comes to Balak. He accepts the invitation and he comes to Balak, even though God at first wanted to prevent him from coming, and then said, no, you can go, but you can only say the words that I put in your mouth. So Bilam says, from Aram, Balak, king of Moab, led me from the mountains of the east and said, come curse Jacob for me. Come bring anger upon Israel. How can I curse that which God has not cursed? How can I cause anger if God is not angry? And so how this is interpreted is that during this whole episode, again, we're talking in human terms here. It says that God, even that split second, there was no anger. So there was no opening for Bilam to curse. So what I want to do now, I want to take this concept and go a bit deeper into the nature of time. Because this whole thing is that Bilam has the ability to calculate or feel or plug in or connect to God's moment of judgment. So to understand this, though, want to understand a little bit about the nature of time. And you'll see we're going to come back to how this applies to our case here with Bilam. So first of all, in Sefer Yetzirah, this is the oldest Kabbalistic text. It posits that there are, in a sense, 5 dimensions. And they're called Olam, Shana, and Nefesh. Olam means world, which means space. And we know that there are 3 dimensions of space. Shana means year, which means time. Einstein revealed time as a dimension. And the third one is called nefesh, which means soul. Soul here is understood to mean consciousness. So now we would ask, well, what dimension is consciousness? So it's very, very interesting that in modern physics, quantum physics, anyone can Google this. Google the role of consciousness in quantum physics today. And you'll get scores of websites, because science is coming to realize the role that consciousness plays in not just reality, but in creating reality. In other words, the effect that consciousness, or what in science is called the observer, that the observer affects that which he or she is observing. There is no such thing as being like detached from what we are observing. We have an effect, a scientific effect. So this is what we're talking about, nefesh. So we see that time is the intermediary between soul and consciousness and space. So the way we want to explain this is we have a concept called yesh mi'ayin, that God created something from nothing, ex nihilo. Now this is a very, very mystical concept, very, very mystical concept, the idea of something from nothing. The closest that we can get to that is the Big Bang. The Big Bang, there was no world, there's no time, there's no space, there's no anything other than God. And then this is what science posits, that an infinitely small, we'll call it a speck of blank matter explodes, and all of the galaxies all come from this one infinitely small speck of space. Now, if that's not mystical, I don't know what is. Without going into it, the Kabbalah talks about this, the Zohar talks about very much like the Big Bang. This is, in a sense, this was already spoken about. And this is the closest we get to something from nothing. So every day in our prayers, we say that God, in his goodness, renews the work of creation. Uvetuvo mechadesh b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh bereshit. Every day, God renews the creation. In other words, the creation was not a one-time event, and now it's just running on momentum. But God is recreating the world at every split second. Yesh mi'ayin. And the amazing thing is, I'm just guessing, around 20 years ago, science began to detect particles in every atom that come into existence for about a billionth of a second, and then they go out of existence. They come in and out of existence. And this is exactly what Kabbalah said. It's not that God is recreating the world every day. At every split second, the world is being recreated. So a way to understand this and to understand time. Now, this is a teaching from Rav Ginsburg, and he explains that this pulsation of going from nothing to something, each one of those pulsations is what creates time. Time is a result of the recreation of the world at every moment. And the way we can understand this is through the image of what used to be called moving pictures. For those who are old enough or have studied this, it used to be, if you would go to a movie theater, there would be a movie projector that had a reel, and on the reel was I guess you call it a tape that had individual frames. And because it was going so quickly, the observer sees action, smooth action, celluloid. Thank you, James. Sees smooth action. Now, what happens? I've seen this, I remember this. Sometimes the projector breaks down, and all of a sudden it starts going in slow motion, and you see the individual frames. Now, these individual frames are framed by the celluloid, and it's black, and the frame is in the middle. So this is all a way just to understand that we experience time as a ongoing flow from past to present to future. I mean, a one direction. It's called, time is called one directional, whereas space, you can go in both directions. Height and width and length is in two directions. Time only goes in one direction, at least the way we experience it. In our consciousness, though, even as I'm talking right now, probably half of you are somewhere in the past, thinking about something in the past, or future tripping about something in the future. And we all do this all day long. All day long, we're going back and forth in our memories to the past, and we're trying to project the future. And for many of us, the present barely exists, as we're hanging out in the past and the future. But the idea here is that this idea of the frames is the black celluloid is like the nothingness. And that creates, each frame is a segment of time. It's a segment of time. And so now I just want to take that concept and apply it to Bilam now. So Bilam, according to tradition, we don't know exactly what he went through, but he was the counter energy to Moshe. In other words, he had phenomenal powers. And if you look at the last of his predictions, these are some of the deepest prophecies in the entire Torah. He lays out everything that's going to happen in the Messianic era. So he had true prophecy. But prophecy, like everything else, can go either way. In other words, a prophet or someone who is in tune with higher levels of consciousness, we still have to make decisions. We could go towards the good, or we could go towards the negative. It's nothing is guaranteed. And just like almost everything in life is depending on how you use it, how you relate to it. It could be used for the good, it could be used for the evil. So somewhere along the line, Bilam's ego took over, and he moved towards what we'll call the dark side. There's so many movies that are made of on this concept. The whole Star Wars series was based on Darth Vader and the battle of good and evil, of light and darkness. But this is what we're talking about with Bilam and Moshe in a sense. So Bilam has the ability to connect to the nothingness. But for him, he thinks that the nothingness, this is either God's presence is not there, or that's where he can plug into negativity. So in other words, Bilam has in this pulsation of yesh mi ayin, from something from nothing, Bilam can connect to the nothingness, but his understanding of the nothingness is directly opposite of ours. As I'll explain now, that according to the Arizal, and many of you have heard this probably many times, but when God wanted to create the world, he had a problem. Where was a finite world going to fit into infinity? Where would a world that has a consciousness that it appears to be something other than God, where do you put it when all there is the infinite light of God? So the Arizal, based on the Zohar, proposes the idea called Tzimtzum, that God contracted his infinite being in order to create a vacuum. And in the vacuum, he's shown, this is the Big Bang, he's shown a ray of light into the middle of the vacuum. And from that ray of light comes all of existence. Now, the question is, what is happening in this vacuum? So Hasidus explains that even in this vacuum, there is no such thing as something that is devoid from God's presence. But some people can perceive it that way. And that's Bilam. Bilam, when he connects to the nothingness, to the vacuum, he is connecting to what he experiences as a lack of God's presence, or the opposite of the place from where evil comes from. And therefore he connects to that place, and from there he can curse. But now I'm going to bring an amazing Torah from the Baal Shem Tov. It says in the Gemara, Ein mazal liYisrael. There is the astrological the constellations do not rule Israel. Ein mazal liYisrael. Mazal means a constellation. In astrology, it's the astrological signs and their influences and the planets. It says there is no rulership of the planets over Israel. Now, the assumption here is if Israel is connected to God and Torah. If we are not connected to God and Torah, then in a sense, we are like everyone else, and the planets do affect us. They affect us tremendously. And in fact, when you look in the Talmud, there's an enormous amount of astrological wisdom there. The part of astrology that is considered forbidden is to try to predict the future through astrology. That is what is forbidden. But the sages understood very well that the planets most certainly have an effect on us. Anyone who goes to a beach at different times of the month, you could actually see the water line. You could see the effect that the moon has on the earth. And human beings are 90% water. So the moon affects us just like the tides and all of the planets. But the sages say, Ein mazal liYisrael. So the Baal Shem Tov, he explained that anytime you say the word ein, which means no, none, no rulership of the constellations over Israel, you can interpret it as the Ein Sof, the infinite one. That's what we call God in the aspect of being infinite, Ein Sof. So he reads it. He doesn't read it, there is no rulership of the constellations over Israel. He reads it, the infinite one is the rulership over Israel. That is whose direction or whose power or whose influence we are under. So going back to Bilam, so at the end of this parsha, Bilam tries 3 times to curse the Jews, and God only allows him to say blessings. The 4th time, he just prophesies about the future. And then at the end of the story, there's this whole idea that the women of Midian and Moab come and entice the men of Israel. It became basically an orgy, and it was a terrible scene. And the understanding is Bilam didn't give up. After he couldn't curse the Jews, so he proposed to Balak, I know how to curse them. We'll get them to sin, and they will in effect curse themselves. So that's exactly what the Baal Shem was saying, that if we're under the rulership of the Ein Sof, or the sages said, then we don't have the power of the constellations over us. But if we're not following Torah and mitzvot and we're disconnected from God, then we fall prey to the influences of this world. So at the end, so that was Bilam's last stand. I'll get Israel to sin, and that's how I'll end up cursing them. So some of the ideas I brought to are not simple ideas, are not simple. We were just trying to understand on a deep, deep level, what does it mean that Bilam could perceive the split second when God is angry? So therefore, I tried to explain on a very, very deep level just how time, in a sense, works. And there are, like I say, even science acknowledges now there is this pulsation literally in a billionth of a second. It's like, actually they have now, it's hard to contemplate, but they have clocks that can actually measure a billionth of a second. That's how advanced science has become. It's quite amazing, quite amazing. So here we had like a lesson in the nature of time, and attempted to understand at least how Bilam tried to plug into a negative, dark, judgmental energy, but God was protecting us. And so we'll end with a blessing that we should, if we stay connected to God, then all of the Bilams in the world will not be able to curse us.